Picture this. Nigel Farage sitting in his GB News chair, absolutely seething because Keir Starmer ghosted him. Like, properly ghosted him. No reply, no acknowledgement, not even a cheers for the letter, mate, but no thanks. Just radio silence. And we're not talking about some random DM on Twitter here. We're talking about a formal letter about House of Lords representation that apparently went straight into Starmer's political spam folder. Now Farage has taken to the airwaves to absolutely tear strips off the Prime Minister, accusing him of being part of an establishment conspiracy to shut Reform UK out of the entire political system. And honestly, whether you think Farage is a political genius or the political equivalent of Marmite, you have to admit this is peak British politics drama. So buckle up, because we're diving deep into this latest Westminster spat that's got more passive-aggressive energy than a family WhatsApp group during Christmas dinner planning. Let's set the scene properly here, because context matters. Yesterday, the government announced a fresh batch of nominations to the House of Lords. 25 shiny new Labour peers ready to take their seats in that gilded chamber and vote exactly how the whips tell them to. 3 Conservative nominations, because apparently even the opposition gets a consolation prize, and 5 Liberal Democrat appointments, which is actually quite generous considering the Lib Dems have fewer MPs than you can count on 2 hands. But Reform UK? The party that's currently leading national opinion polls? The party that's topped the last 150 voter intention surveys? The party that's just become the largest in Britain by membership? Absolutely nothing. Zero. Zilch. Nada. Not even a courtesy peer to warm the bench. Now, this isn't just Farage being dramatic for the sake of it, though let's be honest, the man does enjoy a good bit of theater. Reform UK had actually made a formal request earlier this year for the right to nominate peers. They'd made the case that as a party with significant public support, leading in the polls, and with genuine electoral momentum, they deserved representation in Parliament's upper chamber. It's not an unreasonable argument, really. Every other small party, and by small, Farage means those with limited House of Commons representation, has some kind of voice in the Lords. The Greens have peers. Plaid Cymru has peers. Even the DUP has peers. But Reform? Apparently, they can write all the polite letters they want and they'll still get treated like they're invisible. Speaking on his GB News show, Farage didn't hold back. He launched into what can only be described as a proper rant about the whole situation, questioning whether Keir Starmer is being a hypocrite. And you know what? He's got a point to make here, even if you disagree with everything Reform stands for. The optics are genuinely terrible. Here's a government that constantly talks about representing the people, about listening to voters, about democratic legitimacy, and yet they're completely ignoring a party that's leading in every single poll. It's like organizing a party and deliberately not inviting the most popular kid in school because you personally don't like them. Petty? Absolutely. Politically smart? That's debatable. Farage revealed that he'd written what he described as a very polite letter to the Prime Minister 3 months ago, making the case for reform to have some kind of voice in the Lords. 3 months ago. That's plenty of time for a response. That's enough time to draft the reply, have it reviewed by advisors, run it past legal, translate it into Latin and back again, and still send a courtesy acknowledgement. But apparently, Starmer couldn't even be bothered with that. Not even a "Dear Nigel, thanks for your letter, but we've decided to go in a different direction" type response. Just complete silence. And that, more than anything else, seems to have genuinely rattled Farage. What's particularly interesting is how personal Farage made this. He said, and this is quite revealing, that he used to think Starmer was basically a pretty reasonable bloke with whom he just disagreed on policy. That's actually quite a generous assessment from someone who's politically opposed to everything Starmer represents. It suggests that despite their differences, Farage had maintained some level of professional respect for the Prime Minister. But now he's not quite so sure. The lack of even a courtesy reply has apparently shifted Farage's entire perception of Starmer from reasonable opponent to establishment gatekeeper actively trying to shut reform out of the political system. And here's where Farage really cranked up the rhetoric. He accused Starmer of being part of an establishment that's not only shutting down free speech, but literally wants to shut reform out of the whole political system. Those are pretty serious accusations. We're not just talking about a disagreement over parliamentary procedure here. We're talking about fundamental questions of democratic representation and political exclusion. Farage called it pretty appalling. And regardless of what you think of his politics, you can understand why he's annoyed. When you're leading in the polls, when you've got the largest membership base in the country, when you're winning council by-elections left and right, and you can't even get a single peer appointed, it does start to look like the system is rigged against you. But let's zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture, because this isn't just about hurt feelings and unanswered letters. The timing of these labor appointments is absolutely crucial to understanding what's actually going on here. The series of labor nominations comes at exactly the moment when the government has been facing staunch opposition from peers over its flagship workers' rights legislation. See, the House of Lords currently has a conservative majority. There are 282 Tory peers compared with Labour's 234. That's a significant disadvantage when you're trying to push through legislation that the opposition fundamentally opposes. So what do you do if you're Labour and you keep getting blocked in the Lords? Simple. You appoint more Labour peers. It's the political equivalent of stacking the deck, and every government in history has done it to some extent. But 25 new Labour appointments in one go? That's not subtle, that's not gradual reform. That's a blatant attempt to shift the balance of power in the upper chamber so the government can actually pass its legislative agenda without constant battles with the Lords. And look, you can argue that's entirely legitimate. The government was elected with a mandate to implement their policies, and if the unelected House of Lords keeps blocking them, then appointing more supportive peers is a reasonable response. But you can also argue that it's deeply cynical and undermines the Lords' role as a revising chamber that's supposed to hold the government to account regardless of party politics. What's making this whole situation even delicious is the sheer hypocrisy of it all. Labour spent years, decades even, arguing for reform of the House of Lords. They've consistently said it's undemocratic, outdated, stuffed full of cronies and political appointees. Tony Blair tried to reform it. Grandin Brown talked about it. Ed Miliband made noises about it. Jeremy Corbyn wanted to abolish it entirely. And Keir Starmer himself has previously expressed support for Lords reform. But now that he's in power, now that he needs those votes in the upper chamber, suddenly appointing 25 new Labour peers doesn't seem quite so problematic. It's the political equivalent of saying the system is broken and needs fixing, but in the meantime, I'm going to use it to my maximum advantage. And this is where Farage's accusation of hypocrisy really lands. If the Lords is supposed to represent a broad cross-section of political opinion, if it's supposed to include voices from across the political spectrum, then excluding the party that's leading in national polls is pretty hard to justify. You can't simultaneously argue that the Lords needs to be more representative and democratic, while also deliberately shutting out the most popular party in current polling. Those positions are fundamentally contradictory. Either representation matters or it doesn't. Either popularity and public support count for something or they don't. You don't get to pick and choose based on whether you like the party in question. Now, let's be fair to Starmer for a moment, because there are legitimate arguments against giving Reform UK peers. First, they only have a handful of MPs, 5 to be precise. The traditional route to getting representation in the Lords has always been through parliamentary representation in the Commons. You win seats, you earn influence, you eventually get to nominate peers. Reform's electoral success is very recent, and you could argue they haven't yet proven they have staying power. One strong showing in a general election doesn't necessarily mean they deserve immediate representation in the Lords. The Lib Dems, despite their reduced numbers, have a long history of parliamentary representation in the Commons. The Greens have been consistently winning seats and building support over decades. Reform is the new kid on the block, and maybe, just maybe, they need to prove they're not a flash in the pan before getting permanent representation in the upper chamber. Second, and this is probably the real reason, even if nobody wants to say it out loud, Reform UK's politics are controversial. Their positions on immigration, on national identity, on various cultural issues are well outside what most of the political establishment considers acceptable. Giving them peers would legitimize those positions, would give them a permanent platform in one of the UK's 2 legislative chambers. And if you're Labour, if you genuinely believe Reform's politics are dangerous or harmful, then you're not exactly going to be rushing to give them more influence, are you? This is the paradox of liberal democracy. Do you include voices you find abhorrent in the name of representation and free speech? Or do you draw lines and say some positions don't deserve a seat at the table? It's a genuinely difficult question without easy answers. But here's the thing. By completely ignoring Farage's request, by not even replying to his letter, by shutting Reform out entirely, Starmer has handed Farage an absolute gift, Because now, Farage gets to play the victim. He gets to position reform as the outsiders being suppressed by the establishment elite. He gets to frame this as proof that the system is rigged, that the old parties are circling the wagons to protect their interest, that reform represents a threat so significant that they need to be actively excluded from power. And that narrative, that plays incredibly well with reform's base. It confirms everything they already believe about British politics being controlled by an out-of-touch establishment that doesn't want to hear the voice of ordinary people. This is Politics 101. If you want to kill a populist movement, the worst thing you can do is give them evidence that the establishment is conspiring against them. You want to deflate their support? Include them. Give them responsibility. Make them part of the system. Force them to compromise, to engage with political reality, to make the difficult trade-offs that governing requires. The moment a populist party becomes part of the establishment, it loses its outsider appeal. But keep them locked out, keep treating them like they don't matter, that's how you create a permanent opposition movement